This is Profound Conversations, a place where we engage in a discussion about humanity, about how we can be better, do better, and live better. We're excited about the opportunity to engage in a discourse with a brother who has put together a prophetic book on Islam in Black America. Brother Amin has laid out in this particular book, and if you don't have it, you need to get your copy of this one. I will show it this way, block my image, because this is a groundbreaking book that talks about this notion of the contribution of Islam, the development of Islam among blacks, and also it's called soulfully indigenous population, right? What has it meant to this population to engage in, to be a part of, and to further grow or not the practice, the faith of Islam? So brother Amin, welcome to Profound Conversations, and thank you for being here. It's just an honor to be able to sit with you. I mean, after reading the book, I'm just excited, brimming over with a variety of ideas and thoughts. And what comes to mind to me out the gate is that you outline in the very beginning, in chapter 1, you talk about Black Islamic thought. You mentioned Edward Wilmot Blyden and Noble Drew Ali and Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and Wallace D. Muhammad. Tell us about this development, right, of Islam in America, because where did it come from? Why is it important? Why are these men that you mentioned so important to the faith?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be your guest, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Those men that you mentioned, let's start with Blyden. Blyden, it was very, very important because as a Christian theologian, he was one of the first people to posit the idea that Islam was the original religion of the Black man. So he's known to be really a forerunner in the whole idea around Black, or as we're calling it now, soulfully indigenous Islamic thought. And then those that came after him that you mentioned, they just took it, each of them added another layer to it. But I would say that out of all of those 5 people that are mentioned, and of course, they all had, varying contributions during various years, during their particular eras, during their runs. I don't think that anyone made a contribution that was more lasting or had more impact than the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And part of that is because he had a run of over 40 years, and it was his leadership and his philosophy that really, influenced a lot that happened after him. And particularly now we see today, even 50 years, after he's departed, we have still another iteration of the Nation of Islam that has existed since 77 under Minister Louis Farrakhan. So Elijah Muhammad is very important in that conversation. But all of them had, some very important contributions. There's much written about, there's something written about Blyden, about Noble Drew Ali, of course, about Malcolm X. And there's not much written about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and there's very little written about his son, Imam W.D. Muhammad, or Wallace D. Muhammad, who became the leader of the Nation of Islam in 1975. So I kind of look at those 5 figures as being, examples of the various expressions of Black Islamic thought. And in order to have a conversation about the state of Islam in Black America, which is the title of the book, we have to at least have some foundational familiarity with the 5 of them.
Thank you, Brian. Right, the state of Islam in Black America. So you mentioned those 5 as 5 pillars, right? And you mentioned the contribution of formerly Elijah Poole, now then Elijah Muhammad, and its contribution. I would submit that there's a layer to that has to be really uncovered, and that is with the Malcolm X phenomenon, because that not only seemed to have sparked, and we could talk about this later, but that seemed to spark some interest in that era, being a figure to be able to communicate to a populace, but also when Spike Lee returns with the film Malcolm X, or X, it began to also inspire individuals to look at it that in the 80s and 90s. So we will touch that, but I just wanted to also touch upon these various. I'm dealing with the contributions, right? What do you think of the contribution was? but you also mentioned these various temples, right? The Moorish Science Temple and so forth. Explain those. Talk. Can we just people because a lot of us don't know about these various temples that exist. I mean, we know about the AME and the CME and the AME
Right.
Zion and the Black Baptist, but we don't know about the movements of our people. And you go back to 1921 with the Moorish temple, and you end with the African American mosque. Oh, wait, now you go to 1933, but the African American mosque. Tell us about some of those movements that we need to know about.
I purposely, and I was very intentional about not going into any real detail in the book about those, because there's some great works of scholarship that have been written about the Moorish Science Temple and those early and I call those groups, they're the forerunner groups to the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam just was able to become the more popular out of all of those early groups. But the Moorish Science Temple, 1929, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, they were very strong in my birth city, Newark, New Jersey. And Noble Drew Ali was one of the first people to make this connection of soulfully indigenous people or Black people actually being Moors, thus the Moorish Science Temple. So he made a very important cultural contribution in trying to get people to look at themselves from beyond, the lens of Blackness. So one of the challenges that people have with Noble Drew Ali from a theological standpoint is that he, like Elijah Muhammad, they were very broad and liberal in their theological doctrine. So the Moorish Science Temple actually had their own Quran that was different, and that is different from the Quran that's popularly used by Muslims today. So what I find Noble Drew Ali did, he really appropriated a lot of the what we would call orthodox or traditional teachings of Islam. And he was the first that we see who tried to make these things fit in a way that was palatable to the people that he was trying to reach. And then Elijah Muhammad improved upon that and borrowed some from Garvey, which we don't mention in the book because it's not necessarily germane to the religion of Islam. But then Elijah Muhammad took, some of what Noble Drew Ali had in terms of the cultural part, and then took the economic philosophies of Garvey and blended that into an interpretation of Islam that didn't exist prior to Elijah Muhammad beginning to do his work. So again, that's why in the book I mentioned many of these texts by name, where you can go into detail about some of these early communities. And Dr. Kyrie, I think is very important, because although the Nation of Islam is often, because of the Spike Lee movie and many other, popular treatments that the nation received in the media, many people, when they think of soulfully indigenous Muslim, they automatically go to the Nation of Islam. So I have to make it clear, to those that may be watching, that there were, even before the Nation of Islam, there were a lot of soulfully indigenous Muslim populations and centers in America. It's just that the Nation of Islam grew with, in terms of popularity. And it's no coincidence that when Malcolm X came on the scene, then that allowed the nation to go to another level in terms of its popularity in the public space due to his charisma, his understanding of media and all of those things that you really need if you're going to build any type of successful social religious movement.
Right. So that's very important for people to know that there were forerunners to the Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. I think that is critical.
Yes, we used to make the distinction when I was growing up as a kid in the nation. We used to make the distinction that we had the Nation of Islam, and then we would have what we would call orthodox Muslims. Orthodox today would be interpreted as quote unquote Sunni Muslims. Sunni derived from Sunnah or tradition, as it means in English, that those that follow, that adhere to the tradition of Muhammad the Prophet, to whom the Quran was revealed, prayers and peace be upon him. So there was always this clear, juxtaposition of Nation of Islam versus Orthodox Muslims. And there was always kind of a tension, with Orthodox Muslims, because they felt that the nation was misinterpreting Islam from a theological standpoint. But the nation grew with such leaps and bounds that it really didn't matter what the Orthodox interpretation was, because, and I've heard the great scholar, the late scholar, Dr. John Henry Clark, he argued once, he said that if Elijah Muhammad had come during his time with a traditional or Orthodox version of Islam, he might have had 10 followers. He might have had 10 followers, but he knew that he had to appropriate it in order to be able to reach the people that he was trying to reach. So although he taught, his interpretation of Islam, a lot of it was Bible centered, and biblical scripturally centered, because he knew that he was pulling from people that had a Christian background. So you had a lot of the early people that joined the Nation of Islam. They came from the church. They were rooted in the church tradition.
As was he, right? Yeah, that's going to deal with.
Absolutely.
Right.
Son of a Baptist preacher.
Exactly.
Who had
right.
aspirations of being a preacher himself.
So he grew up in that particular tradition, and so not only would he have to appropriate it, but he also, that's what he knew, so he could then liken it to what he grew up with. I think that's important. And this idea of orthodox, that's a long-standing discourse, because I think if we look at, for example, Christianity. The reason that it is just the way that it exists in this country is because of Constantine appropriating constructs and ideas and ideology from various groups. That's why you have around this season of the year, Easter bunnies laying eggs, right? Because there were various traditions, Zoroastrianism and others, where Romans and so forth, painting women and going and finding, various fertility celebrations and observances. So he put them together into one, and that's how even Christianity blew up. So we have to be clear that people, when they desire a certain movement to take place, you have to go from the known and get to the unknown. Yes. And so I can clearly see how that would be going from the known into the unknown. Also to retrofit it in such a way that it does have meaning and application to a population, rather than so being adherent to a tradition. The question becomes, as some would say, what do it do, right? How does it work? How does it function?
And that's very important.
I think that becomes a draw. The other thing I find very intriguing by the movements, and we have so much to talk about, is that you mentioned Newark, New Jersey. So many of them actually have their naissance not in the South, but somehow in the Northeast. So we'll talk about that at some point. If not this one, we got to keep this one going. But yes. I do want to highlight something that you mentioned about the Nation of Islam, but the movements that predated, right? The movements of thought. Why do you think the thought of Blyden and why do you think the Honorable Elijah Muhammad became so popular? Because why were they so important, and why did they become such a prominent figures in Black life in this country?
Particularly the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. You look at. Let's start with geography and where he was introduced into Islam as he knew it, in Detroit, Black Bottom, Detroit, in a Depression era, right? So you look at that reality. And my father, by the way, is from Detroit. He moved to Newark when he was 9 years old. So I used to go visit Detroit regularly. I kind of understand, the layout of Detroit.
So he moved from where? He moved from where? He
moved from Detroit to Newark.
At
9 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
So he didn't join the Nation of Islam until he was a teenager in Newark. But I think that I always tell him that somewhere in his DNA, that idea was implanted in his head from his years in Detroit. So when you look at Elijah Muhammad, and when you look at the condition that he was under, when you study, if you've ever read anything about the biography of Elijah Muhammad, he had a very difficult time, during the 30s. And it was him being able to, I would say, I hate using this lift himself up by the bootstraps term, but he used Islam as it was introduced to him as a way of picking himself up out of one of the worst social situations that, a person can be in. So he then took that message to people, and the fact that it was rooted in this idea of being able to identify a common oppressor. Anytime you have a philosophy that's driven around a common oppressor, and that begins to resonate with people, you can see that, take traction. So over the years, as he began to cultivate his message, Christianity, as it was taught in many places, during Elijah Muhammad's run, he used to really bash it as being the slave master's religion. And he will blame Christianity as being the very reason why people didn't think with independent thought and didn't go to do something for themselves. So that goes back to, as we talked earlier, about Blyden, who made the connection that Islam was more of a fit for Black people, for soulfully indigenous people, than Christianity because of the underpinnings of slavery. Now, we can have a whole nother conversation about the Arab slave trade and those other things, that we know to be part of the history. But in terms of how Elijah Muhammad's message to Black people, that was really a very central feature of his engagement. So then when Malcolm was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, and of course he came home from prison, but he was so inspired by what he had read in his correspondence with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that he was very excited. And when he came home and he didn't see the message resonating at the level that he thought it should, it really fired him up and committed him to go out and just get people. So during that 12-year period that Malcolm was with Elijah Muhammad and he served as national representative for a great number of those years, you saw the nation really begin to grow, because now you had a young, articulate person who was able to not just make this connection to the common oppressor, but he was able to give it, as what you spoke about earlier, he was able to give practical application to it and say, look at your neighborhood, look at your communities. Who's the biggest exploiter? Who's the biggest source of your collective oppression? And he was able to identify that, and it resonated with people all throughout the country. So we can never dismiss that period of time up to 1964, which is when Malcolm ultimately left the nation after he was suspended. But very important to note, the biggest growth in Nation of Islam history actually occurred in 1965 up to 1975, during that 10-year period post-Malcolm X. The registration numbers grew at an unprecedented level, and the economic development program of the nation grew at a level that so much so that after a 10-year period, by 1975, it's estimated that the nation had about $85 million worth of holdings. Real estate, farmland, commercial properties, other things like that, all throughout the country. $85 million in 1975 is a substantial portfolio.
Indeed, it is. It is today. But I wanted to speak to something, and about the economic development is critical, right? The speaking to the conditions of a people, I think, is so important. And so we see then where Elijah Poole, then the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, speaks to a condition of a population, which then makes the practice of Islam plausible, because now I have something I can hold on to, and I don't have to just simply say that they're nothing but the blood of Jesus. Right. I can now say something else, and then it gives me identity. So I think the idea of somehow distinguishing oneself from the oppressor becomes a profound attraction for Blacks to become a part of, or social indigenous population people to become a part of the nation, or as it was evolving. And then the capacity of Malcolm X, El Haj Mix Shabazz, his ability to be able to string words together, yes, in a way, in a profound way, right? I think it was conceptually sound, but then the profound voice also becomes an attraction to a population. And I would submit to you that my real keen interest in the Nation of Islam really comes from and through Malcolm X, and reading the book. I was aware of certain things in that era, but in certain parts of the South, it's like, don't listen to that, right? And it was from the book and from some other information content that I began to look at the Nation of Islam in a very different way.
Yes, sir.
And so you mentioned that's what we know, and that is what we know. We don't know about this. The Sunni or the Shiite, or we don't know about the orthodox discourse. But I think that's important. Even more important is, again, application, right? Taking theory.
Right. And that's
there we go.
Right. Yes. And that was one of the things that kind of prompted me to really want to write The State of Islam in Black America. And in that last part, looking toward the future, because for me, practical application is everything. And if you have any faith tradition and it's not rooted in practical application, then it goes nowhere. So we have this understanding in Islam, the broader understanding of Islam, where some may try to just be what I would call maybe a bit too dogmatic about adhering to the tradition. And tradition is very important. and we understand the Quran. The Muslims, we all agree, and we believe that that's, revealed text and that is timeless. However, the thinking Muslim will always submit and posit that the application of the Quran is always going to be dictated based on time, place, and circumstance. So the application of that book has to evolve, and it has to be able to evolve in a way where it can meet the challenges that each society finds themselves facing during their particular time. And that's fundamentally key to me. And honestly, Dr. Kyrie, that's a hill that philosophically I'm willing to die on. And I have debates with many Muslims about that, who would try to shun away from practical application and who would try to make the argument that we as soulfully indigenous Muslims in America can practice Islam is the same way it was practiced during the time of the Prophet, prayers and peace be upon him. And I say that notion is really sheer nonsense for me, because if it doesn't keep up with the application, or practical application for the time you find yourselves in, then it just becomes irrelevant, and it just becomes empty scripture, and it leads to the practice of what I've coined this term, theoretical Islam, where there's no practical application, there's no movement from it. It's just exercise and discourse in theory and theology that doesn't move the needle at all. And it's
right. So people eroticize their own intellect, right? By saying they're adhering to the authentic movement aspect, but never any application. So go ahead. I cut you off.
No. Let me say this last point. And ironically, or not so ironically, the soulfully indigenous Muslim population is more obsessed with adhering to that tradition than other ethnicities of Islam in America, to the point where if you go, and I have this discussion, and I've traveled through communities all throughout the country, you don't see many immigrant communities that have splits based on theology. They usually have any splits or any differences or wrinkle will be on organizational development and administration and things of that nature. But we've seen entire soulfully indigenous communities split on one point of ideology or 2 points of ideology. The whole movement could fall apart. And people will split off and even go and start another mosque or masjid or Islamic center just based on a theological points, where the immigrant population understands that at the end of the day, the practical application is the point that we have to work through in order to be able to find common ground and move forward and make progress. And if you don't do that, you're just going to constantly be spinning your wheels on these theological issues, and then you're never going to be able to be in a position where you're prepared to weigh in on the pressing issues of our time. Why? Because you're still stuck with debating about something that happened or that was interpreted back in the 7th century. You can't spend any time on application for 21st century.
Right. So again, in this book, The State of Islam in Black America, we have Brother Amin discussing the development of Islam in this country, and he takes a section in this book. It talks about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and talks about how his wife encouraged him to go and hear Wallace D. and hear that discussion. So again, it's a family movement, right? The wife said, "Hey, go take a look at this," and then he looks at how to Tipple number 1, Detroit. This is in the book. Very good, some very good information, and how that becomes a movement to address people coming out of World War II, the dynamics of Black life in America. And I think that's critical, because the religious application, the religion speaks to the faith, speaks to the application of life. Very similarly for other religions, and some of them that actually fade out because they're not speaking to the condition of a population. And so this is talked about in the book. And you also go into discussing the son of Elijah Muhammad and his movement, his activity with the movement. Right. And I think that's important as well. I love how you speak about his challenge or his struggle.
Yeah, it's very, very important. Wallace D. Muhammad, who was born to Elijah Muhammad and Clara Muhammad, who you just mentioned, he was always known to be one of the more spiritual children of Elijah Muhammad. But he always grappled with various parts of his father's theological teaching, in as much that it differed from what he knew and studied in terms of traditional Islam. So, and before we even go into Wallace D. Muhammad, let me say this: much of what Elijah Muhammad taught foundationally, we can also make the connection to traditional Islam. But in many ways, Elijah Muhammad was laying the foundation for these things, so that later on, as the movement developed, then these theological principles will be able to be practiced in a better way. I give you an example. One of the issues that he used to talk about oftentimes, being Elijah Muhammad, he used to talk about this idea of heaven and hell. In Islam, in the religious discourse of Islam, in the theological discourse of Islam, we believe that there's an actual heaven and actual hell. Elijah Muhammad, we see, also believed that too, but he didn't stress it, because he made the point that when people became fixated on that, then they would just not do anything, because they would have this concept that somebody already died for your sins, so you're going to go to heaven anyway. And I've heard him, and I've watched him in videos, and I remember him as a young man, hearing him give lectures, and he would say, I'm trying to get you out of that slavery thinking, because he would equate that kind of thinking to the thinking that the slave master would use on you, on us, on our ancestors on the plantation, that they should endure these horrible conditions and all of that, because they were going to go off to a better place at some point in time, and they'd cross through the pearly gates and everything would be fine. So Elijah Muhammad wanted to kill that whole idea, even though we know that it's an idea of heaven and afterlife, that we find that something to be rooted in all of the faith traditions. But his son Wallace wanted to see the nation move further along theologically, so he was always at odds with his father about the timing of that. And of course, because the nation being the close-knit entity that it was, he couldn't have the risk of having his son or anybody else just going teaching these things in a manner that he felt would be disrupted, or in the time frame that he felt the nation wasn't ready for. So it wasn't until Wallace was handed the mantle of leadership that he was able to put forth some of these things and be able to give context to some of the things that his father taught. And he was the one that actually moved the Nation of Islam toward what we would refer to religiously as orthodoxy, to the point that one of the first things he did is that he changed the name of the organization from the Nation of Islam to the World Community of Al-Islam in the West, because he wanted to make the connection, or he wanted to make it known that the nation was now evolving into the worldview of Islam, and that it was more than just a nation, and it was beyond, ethnicity, and that it would become part of the global, then 1 billion, now 2 billion Muslims in the world. So he was very adamant about that. And over the 33 years that, that he taught among us before his passing, September 9th, 2008, he was really adamant about moving what was the nation and the people that remained during his, what we call the transition. He wanted to make sure that we were properly centered in our American reality. He was very big on that and very particular about that. So we always see that the community today, as we call it, the community in association with Imam W.D. Muhammad, that community has always been a community that's been very active in public life, in civic involvement, politics, things of that nature, because he was all about claiming the Americanness, whereas the Nation of Islam is, basically taught separatism. Yeah, we're American, but we look at ourselves as not being equal until we receive the same treatment that other people receive that don't look like us.
And that's both voices are very profound, and I can clearly hear the necessity of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I can also see the understanding, the insight of Wallace D. Muhammad, and they both are needed.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure for this segment, I want to make sure that we double down on this idea of economic development, because you mentioned that between the years 65 and 75 or thereabout, that became a point of economic development for the Nation of Islam.
Yes. And
what intrigues me is that a population can have men on the streets in suits, right, in the hot sun, selling improbable products. I even talk about this in one of my podcasts. Talk about the issue of my podcast, a discussion I had during COVID, that improbable products, right? Who wants a bean pie, right? I get a sweet potato pie. I get a whole lot of apple pie,
right?
But a bean pie, so improbable. And then a newspaper, right?
Right.
Muhammad Speaks or the Final Call now. Who, and for a population that doesn't even read much about news, right? And so you have improbable conditions, black men, suits, hot sun, And there is a conviction to move a product, man, do for self. So irrespective of what anybody thinks about the Islam or thinks about the Nation of Islam, anything else, one would have to look at the psychological disruption that the Nation of Islam was able to cause within the minds of a population that was oppressed. Be able to take a position to say, I can and I will do this, right? And that has to be acknowledged, which then leads to this economic development piece. Share more about the economic development part as we close out this segment. What was, you said land acquisition, so forth and so on. How did that happen?
Elijah Muhammad was, his mantra was do for self. You know, it was two philosophies in the nation: accept your own and be yourself. And then the other model was do for self. He said that the best way for us to illustrate that we were equal partners, you know, in this shared, you know, human space is that we had to do for self. He said, nobody's ever going to respect you if you're begging for crumbs from the former slave master's children's table. That was his philosophy. And he articulated that very strongly and very passionately. So you have in many of the major cities, you start to see Muslim businesses, you know, just sprout up all over the place. And just to go back to the point you mentioned about the newspaper, you know, early 1970s, Muhammad Speaks newspaper had a weekly circulation that peaked at 1 million copies per week. So imagine that, an independent entity selling 1 million newspapers in a week. And a lot of those papers were sold to people that weren't interested to join in the Nation of Islam. They would never join the Nation of Islam, but they were so intrigued and so inspired by seeing people, you know, that were just committed to purpose and to a cause. And then in those cities where Muslim businesses existed, that was one of the main draws to get people to come and become interested in the Nation of Islam. I look at the example in Newark, New Jersey. You know, my father and his two partners, they owned a restaurant that became popular in the soulfully indigenous culture, the Black culture, called the Steak and Take. You have this Philly cheesesteak. The Steak and Take is the forerunner of that. It was our own sandwich that was kind of created within the Nation of Islam culture. New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and then it spread to different places throughout the country. Young people would just come and hang out at the Steak and Take, be introduced to the culture of the Nation of Islam. Then they'd get invited to the temple. Next thing you know, that person registered in the Nation of Islam, you know, changing their whole life outlook, and it had become a productive member and citizen of the Nation of Islam. And that happened all throughout the country. So the economic development portion or the economic development program of the Nation of Islam was a very important aspect of the attraction that people had for the Nation of Islam. And when you went into a Nation of Islam business during those times, it was unlike any other business you ever went to in terms of just the immaculate condition and the quality of the products. I remember when I used to make visits to Chicago with my parents for various Nation of Islam activities, we would go into our own supermarket that we had there called Your Supermarket, because the nation had a brand of canned goods called Your Products, where we used to can the vegetables from our own farm. And I swear, Dr. Kyrie, those apples from Your Supermarket that were from our farm, to me, they taste better than any apples that I ever had from ShopRite or Pathmark or any other place. That's right. And I knew it was psychological, you know, an apple was an apple. But for some reason, they were shinier, they were juicier. and it just gave me a sense of pride knowing that these were things that we produced, that people that just giving their dollars, quarters, nickels, and dimes were able to invest into what we built, which was an economic infrastructure. And I think part of that is what's missing today in the soulful indigenous Muslim construct as we see it today, because we've gone away from, in many cases, entrepreneurship or community-based business. And this is why in the city of Newark, sadly, if I want to go to a Muslim restaurant occasionally and eat soul food, you got to go to an immigrant restaurant. It's got an immigrant from Palestine selling us fried chicken and macaroni and cheese. Because we've abandoned economic development sometimes in the pursuit of orthodoxy. And I think that the two can mutually exist, where we can focus on economic and community development and not lose our spiritual footing. And that was one of the things that Imam Muhammad was concerned about. He didn't want us to be so concerned with continuing the nation building aspect that we lost out in our spiritual development. But too many of us, we didn't listen to him fully, and we threw out the baby with the bathwater, and we just abandoned economic development altogether. So I think that going forward for the state of Islam in Black America, we're going to have to bring that component back. And that's going to be a key aspect in helping us level the playing field against what we find ourselves facing today.
We're talking with Brother Qasim Amin Nathari, and he's written a book called The State of Islam in Black America. And he talked about the development of Islam in America. And I think that is very important. And where do we go from here? The next step deals with the economic development part. And I think that it's important to recognize that from Blyden to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad to Minister Louis Farrakhan, that there has been a movement in this country that has helped to shape consciousness, to be able to bring some notion of character to a population, to be able to stand upright on their own 2 feet, and as you said, do for self, as opposed to being begging somebody to do for them. And so I think that it's important to know that this particular practice, this faith, with its various tentacles, its various expressions, as all faiths have various expressions, has done something within a community, soulful indigenous community, a Black community, people of African descent, however the group is identified, has done something for that population to be able to see themselves as human in very inhumane conditions or context. And so we thank you, Brother Amin, for this discussion. And it is not over, because we have part 2, and part 2 deals with what do we do now with this feel good moment of feeling good about ourselves, because we know that also we heard the brother says that if you motivate a fool, you only have a motivated fool. So we have to talk about what do we do.
Yes.
With this, how do we develop? So thank you. This is Profound Conversations, a place of building healthy communities through profound discussions, not because of the discussion of the people being profound, but because the process of discussing becomes profound, and it leads to profound enlightenment of what do we do next. So it's how to be better, do better, and be better.